So, my fascination with things fort-like and maritime started when I was very young, because I spent a lot of time in Florida. And also, I spent a lot of time up here in Maryland, because my dad's family is from Baltimore, 3711 3rd Street for the last 50 years, which is in, they call it Brooklyn Park, Baltimore, not too far from Fort McHenry. And I used to go to Baltimore and watch the fireworks on Federal Hill, and steeped in all of that history. So when I got to college, my background, I thought I was going to be an elementary school teacher. That lasted for about a week, and I was kind of over that very quickly. But then I started studying the ancient world, the ancient mariners of the world, through underwater archaeology and ancient history. So I eventually went on to get a PhD in maritime history and archaeology. And that's how I ended up here at the Naval Academy. And they needed someone to teach 104. And I was looking for a job, and voila. So I don't teach 104 very often anymore, because they usually give it to junior officers. But I teach world history, US 1, US 2, because I am a historical archaeologist by training. So when I'm not here teaching, I'm literally digging square holes somewhere. I'm trained to do underwater archaeology, but since I have 2 small children and I can't travel the world like I used to when I was single, I don't really do much of that anymore. So just to kind of give you a little background, I've been fascinated with the sea and things maritime pretty much all my life. And when I first started teaching here in 2011, I was looking for a project for a paper to give at a conference, because I used to give like 3 papers a year. At an international conference, a regional conference, and a local conference, because I've been involved in the Archaeological Society of Maryland for about 15 years. So I was talking to Jim Cheevers downstairs, and we started talking about Fort Severn and Fort Madison, and that no one knew where Fort Madison was, okay. Or where it used to be. And they knew where Fort Severn is. You guys know where Fort Severn is? Yeah, so tell me. Here's a big place. Where is it? Yeah, you guys sleep on top of it pretty much. Fort Severn was actually it wasn't even a fort, they call it Fort Severn. The whole property was a fort, but the structure itself was actually a round gun battery. And I have some pictures to show you in a minute. But because this started out as an army base, no, don't tell anybody. But initially, Fort Severn was an army base. It was only 10 acres. It was a very small little peninsula. You realize almost everything you walk around here at the Naval Academy is fill. And I also have some other maps to show that. It's really kind of stark. So I was like, well, that sounds awesome. I'm all into that. Where can I find this Fort Madison stuff? And Jim was like, I don't know. Nobody knows anything about it. I mean, they know that it was over there. We've seen it on maps. So I kind of started on this Fort Madison project. So if you were here in 2011 or 2012, which probably you weren't because it was a long time ago, I got to work on an archaeology project over there. I took a bunch of mids, we dug a bunch of holes, I went to the National Archives, I went to the mapping wing of the National Archives, which is in Suitland. They have this great practice of taking all of the primary records, letters that came from the Army back in the day, and separating the maps from them whenever Army officers would send in reports. So the maps are in one place, and the letters talking about the forts and the upkeeps in the forts are in 2 different places. That was a great idea, not who decided to do that. So it became kind of an obsession of mine for a while. So I took 12 mids out there, and we dug over a weekend, and we found all kinds of debris that suggests where the fort used to be. Because I found these great maps and charts that showed exactly where the fort used to be. But this thing was huge, and there was actually 2 forts there. There was a fort built between, under our buddy, Thomas Jefferson, between 1809, and it was finished 1811, 1812-ish, just in time for the War of 1812. And legislation was actually passed starting in 1807 and 1808. And this was a huge fort. Okay, it was on a 5-acre parcel, and it almost took up the entire parcel of land. But there's no visible signs of it anymore. So that was one of those things where archaeologists like, okay, challenge accepted. I'm going to find this building. So going through and walking around, one of the things that archaeologists have to do is we have to do kind of landscape analysis. Okay? So you do background on topography, and you know what a piece of land should look like. Okay? Any of you from the Mississippi Valley part of the United States? Heard of the mound cultures in that part of the world? You know, usually everything's pretty flat, and then all of a sudden you have this mound that looks like, you know, they're building a ramp and they've piled all this dirt up, but it's been there for 5,000 years. So that's part of an old culture, the Mississippian culture. So that's just one obvious example. You know, you're walking around and it's like, that doesn't belong here. So one of the things archaeologists do is we go off and we do a pedestrian survey first. It's a fancy term for walking around and looking at the landscape and telling us, you know, what can the landscape tell us? Has this been modified? How has it been modified? Has it been modified, obviously, by heavy machinery? So it's been in the modern period. Has it been modified? Does it have some kind of terracing? Okay. If you walk around here in Annapolis, you have all these historic houses. If you go in the back, if you've come with your parents and go on historic tours, if you're in the backyards of them, they have these fancy gardens that have these terraces that were dug by hand, because it was a very thing, you know, 17th and 18th century to have your fancy terraced gardens. So one of the things we do. So I'm walking around over there. What else is over there? You've been on that side of the river. So I'm talking about the piece of land. It's almost like a bluff. And you know where you keep the YPs. Okay, so if you're in the YP harbor and you look pretty much north, straight up, Fort Madison used to sit up there. And you know, that whole area where the YPs are is made land. You know, that was initially a huge aircraft hangar. And it was built between World War I and World War II by the Navy to test sea craft, the kinds that had the floats on the bottom of them. So I'm walking around there, and I'm like, why am I so far above the water, A? And, you know, there's these berms and stuff everywhere. So who knows Coach K? He's the guy in charge of shooting things on that side of the river. Okay, so you've been to the gun ranges over there. You may not have been there since, like, you know, plebe summer, but okay. So everything over there now, if you're just walk around, you're going to get shot at. So I couldn't just like stroll in there and start digging. So we had to do a lot of coordination to not get shot at while we were over there. So it's part of the gun range, and that is why Fort Madison is not there anymore. Because when they were expanding the Naval Academy, in between World War I and World War II, parts of the superstructure, which was this huge brick and stone edifice, was in the line of sight, and it was in the way of where they wanted to extend the gun range. Okay? So the Army Corps went in there, and the Seabees do what they do, and they, you know, they dig holes and they move things around, and they got rid of it, literally. They took it down. And it was the second time Fort Madison had been taken down. And I'm going to explain that too. So, you know, Claude and I, when we were talking about this, and the fact that we're going to sail down the Chesapeake and, you know, talk about forts from the War of 1812 and such, forts of the Chesapeake. But we're really going to end up kind of talking about forts of Baltimore and Anne Arundel County, just because I only have, you know, now 40 minutes since I was late. So the Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay is, you know, largest estuary in the world. Maryland is a relatively small state, but we have like more coastline than almost anybody, like California. And it has everything to do with all the little rivers and creeks. And back in the day, in the colonial period, 17th and 18th century, most of these bodies of water were far more navigable than they are now. Okay? They have silted in because of, largely due to tobacco cultivation. Okay? Anybody here from Maryland? No? Okay. So during the colonial period, Maryland was basically a plantation economy, and its cash crop, its commodity that it produced for the mother country was tobacco. Okay? So they would go in, they would cut down trees, which caused erosion. They would plant tobacco, which is horrible for the soil. They could only use it for a couple of years. They would abandon the fields, and they would cut down more trees. Because one thing the colonies had that Britain didn't have was land. So they were not very good stewards of the land back in the day. Oh, lost my picture. So that's one thing to keep in mind. When you're out in the YPs, or if you're kayaking, or whatever you're doing out in the water here, most of the navigable bodies of water here have probably silted in almost by half. There's areas in southern Maryland, one of them is called Port Tobacco, which used to be a very active port. It's now like 2 miles from the water because of all the siltation over the years. And then storms come in and deposit soils. So just kind of keep in mind that the Chesapeake has changed dramatically even since it was settled as the colony of Maryland. So Maryland, 1634, okay, we're one of the earliest colonies. And we were one of the most profitable as far as the crown was concerned. And it was something that the nascent United States government wanted to protect because of the tobacco economy. So that will also come into play as well. If you're walking around Annapolis today, you would kind of wonder why would Annapolis have 2 forts? How many other cities up and down the East Coast can you think of that have 2 forts, or a fort and its own gun battery? Okay. Annapolis was very important in the colonial period. Besides the fact that it was the capital of Maryland, it was the seat of the legislature, of course, as we know, during the American Revolution for a short period of time, during the Continental Congress. It was, close enough to Virginia and many of the founding fathers that they had very close ties with Maryland and Maryland tobacco and Virginia tobacco because they very much worked together. They worked with the same factors, sending their tobacco back to England. Okay, and Maryland, again, its cash crop was one of the things that could be depended upon in the period of the transition from the British colony of Maryland to the state of Maryland. Okay. So even though after Baltimore grew and became so important, starting, say, 1820 is a huge turning point as far as trade shifting away from the South River, which is down, if you're familiar with London town, it's the river south of Annapolis, and the Severn River. There's a huge shift up to Baltimore in the early 19th century. But up until that point, Annapolis was considered important enough to be protected with a gun battery and its own fort at a tremendous expense. Okay. So let's talk about a few forts. I know you all did your readings, right? Okay. So what was the purpose of a seacoast fortress? Anybody? Bueller. Why would you build a fort?
To protect trade and shipping in and out of it.
Bing, bing, bing. You actually nailed it on the head. You have to protect your economic interests, okay? So the purpose of a seacoast fortress or a fort is to protect. You want to either keep something inside of it safe, you want to have large guns there to protect the surrounding area. So when it comes to seacoast fortress, deterrence and defense, okay? Annapolis is far enough up the Chesapeake where we were not one of those areas that we had to worry about pirates. We're not on the coastal Carolinas in Georgia and things like that. But if you're familiar with the history of the West in Europe in the 17th and 18th century, it must be Tuesday. Britain is at war with Spain. It's Wednesday. Britain is at war with France. And the early American government is that kind of thing. That is their context. That's not their history. That's their context. It was very common for different governments to come in and fight over colonial holdings. Think of the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean. Those areas were profitable, and they spent money to protect them because they were producing the commodities rather, that the mother country needed. Okay, so deterrence and defense. Well, we're not even going to bother coming to attack Annapolis because they got this fort and they have all these guns, and it is not worth it. It's kind of the idea. And defense, if it happens to be attacked, Fort Madison was set up in such a way that the line of sight, you literally could not come up the Severn River without sailing straight at Fort Madison because of the way the shoals were. I mean, they spent a lot of time, the early Army Corps did these, well, they wasn't even called the Army Corps then, but they did these bathymetric surveys of the Severn River and literally situated the fort where if a ship was coming to attack Annapolis, they would have to sail directly to the fort. Okay, so that's, you know, they're thinking. So a ship or a series of ships, you know, would not be able to get into the harbor in Annapolis without taking on considerable fire. Okay, and then they would also have the gun battery here at Fort Severn. So very, very well protected. And I would even argue better protected than Baltimore. But also, at the time, Baltimore was very small, much smaller than it is today. Okay, so the list that you made when I first came in, when it comes to Adams and Jefferson and their naval expenditures or their feelings about the Navy, why forts and not ships? I mean, building a fort is expensive. Building a ship is not inexpensive, but you can probably get 5 ships for a fort. You know, do the math. So why wouldn't they just build ships?
Ships have to be maintained.
Ships have to be maintained, and they have to be manned. Okay, what else?
Well, kind of dealing with that, I remember learning that sailors back then were not necessarily the best of society, and so trying to man that would be kind of a constant battle. Instead of having, you know, you didn't have like a standing professional Navy necessarily.
Yes, exactly. In 1807, did the United States of America have a standing army or a navy? No. Okay. So, but if you build a fort, you can, you know, you can use militia style, you know, have a muster, have all the folks from the community come in, they can man the fort. You know, you pay for 5 guns, they stay at the fort at all times. The things that you need, you know, to fire the guns, the gunpowder, the shot, that can all be stored in a protective, you know, structure there on the fort. You're ready to go. Okay, you know, you can be attacked and your ship could be off somewhere else. Okay, so that was kind of Jefferson's idea, especially not necessarily Adams so much, but Jefferson was the one, you know, A, we don't have the money for a navy. B, we don't have the legislative kind of power. We don't have the political will to invest in a navy. Okay, you know, we don't have income tax during this time. Where are they going to get the money for it? Where is money coming from that's going into the federal government during this period in the very early days of the United States? Okay. There's not much because, you know, it's very much 13 separate little countries with a Republican, you know, with a republic that's running things. And each state, you know, Maryland had its own state navy back in the day. It wasn't very robust, but, you know, most of the coastal areas did. So they don't have, the cost is too much. There's not the political will. There's literally not the political mechanism to have it. So the only way that the government was funded, not the only way, but the main way the government was funded during this time was through tariffs. And how are tariffs generated? Through trade. Okay. So the thing they want to protect more than anything else is trade. Okay. So protecting the trade, protecting the cities that are involved in the trade, that is the key. Now, when Jefferson goes to the House and Senate, you know, one of the things he does is he, you know, puts forth, first he has it in a message that he's addressing to Congress, and then you have a series of legislation that is submitted. And he lays out not only what he thinks we should have, but why. Okay, and it's all these reasons we just talked about. It costs too much, political will, and the superiority of shore-based guns. So if you're being attacked, would you rather be on a ship that's going like this to try to hit your target, or would you rather be on something stationary and try to hit your target? Okay, so the idea, we're not in a position to go on the offense. We're not going off and having war with any other country. We had just won our independence. And very shortly, when it comes to the War of 1812, we basically have to fight for it again. Okay. And also, Jefferson does not feel like we need to be in ships somewhere on the other side of the world, or in the Caribbean, or in the northern part of South America, provoking other countries that can blow our navy out of the water in one battle. Okay, because we simply don't have the wherewithal. So, you know, this is how we're going to defend ourselves. This is the plan they come up with, forts. The other issue were gunboats, were like floating gun batteries. You know, take a ship, take all the masts off, take the deck and reinforce it, take the hull and reinforce it, and put a couple of big guns on it. And it's basically, you know, a floating dock with guns. And some areas had that. Annapolis too small, we really didn't need that, plus we had the two forts. But places like Boston would have these floating gun batteries. Okay, so kind of keep this in mind. Okay, so when it comes to the things that I like to research, and how I got into this whole thing about Fort Madison, is that the history of coastal and fort defense, you know, by historians, has been broken up into 4 systems. The first system is basically, you know, during the American Revolution, we threw up earthen things, earthen batteries. They would usually, you know, think of like Lincoln logs with dirt behind them. You know, if it took a hit, it wasn't going to be pretty, but you could at least have a platform to mount a gun, you know, a gun on carriages. And this wasn't, you know, something that was done by the Navy. This was something that was done by the Army, and it was to protect different areas. Okay, so not very robust, and usually battle by battle, you know, kind of a way to defend different areas. So the second system is the one that I've spent the most time researching, and I think the one that is the most fascinating and the one that's most important, actually, when it comes to American history. The second system under Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. Jefferson is the one who basically is the most responsible for it. Okay? Madison continued to implement the plans that Jefferson came up with, that, you know, Congress agreed to. So usually attribute the second system of coastal defense to Jefferson. Okay? So instead of covering the entire Chesapeake, we're going to talk about 3 different forts: Fort McHenry, Fort Washington, and then Fort Madison. Okay. So who's been to Fort McHenry? Anybody? You should go. Okay. Fort McHenry, Baltimore, and of course, it's where the Star-Spangled Banner was written. It is now a very well interpreted and maintained part of the National Park System. So if you have your parents coming to visit, you need somewhere to go for the day, I highly recommend it. Okay. Fort Washington. It's basically built across the river from Mount Vernon. Okay, and I use Fort Washington as an example because Fort Washington and Fort Madison were designed by the same person and built almost at the same time. And, you know, Fort Madison did not survive, but Fort Washington did. And they actually have a very similar timeline in that you have the forts both built in that period between 1808 and 1811. They're both star-shaped, very traditional forts. And then in the 1840s, new thinking about how things are going to be maintained and systems of defense, they tear it down and built these new modern shaped forts. And both properties had the same kind of undertaking. Okay? And then Fort Madison, it's because I have the most information on it, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about that. Okay? So the readings that I gave you ahead of time address these different forts. Fort Washington, again, across the river from, on the Potomac, across the river from Mount Vernon. And, you know, as Washington is being developed, the idea that it's going to be the nation's capital, that it's going to be a prime target, you can, you know, make sense to build a fort there. Okay. The third and fourth systems, I've not spent a tremendous amount of time studying. They are especially favorites of folks who study the Civil War. is majority of the forts from the Civil War are on the other side of the, some of them are on the other side of the Mississippi. Some of them are in that Mississippi River area. Think of New Orleans and places in the South. But most of them on the East Coast in the areas were redeveloped earlier forts. So they would kind of dust off what was there, put in new guns, and do things to make sure that supply lines were accessible. Recharting, especially anywhere in the Carolinas, they would have to rechart the accesses because of how you have shifting sands and such. So the third system is something that when it comes to our forts of topic, they were manned during Civil War. Fort Madison was manned by people from Annapolis during the Civil War, and their biggest complaint was the mosquitoes. They did not feel that they were going to, see a lot of action, as it were, but they definitely left some robust records that are fascinating. And as I've concentrated on the earlier days of Fort Madison, there's a rich body of information to be studied for Fort Madison during the Civil War. Okay. One of the most interesting things that I found is I do a lot of primary records research. What's a primary record? Original first-hand account. So I'm a newspaper geek. Okay, I really love to look at old newspapers. And I found a piece in the New York Times, of all places, where in the 19-teens, leading up to World War I, they used to use Fort Madison to have the midshipmen versus the Marines. And they would play Capture the Fort. And it was something that they did in the spring every year. And it was enough of an event where it would show up in the papers in New York. And they would keep tally of who won. The midshipmen won this year, the Marines won that year. So, even though Fort Madison was taken down, around, we believe, I don't even have the date for originally when it was taken down, because that's one thing that's been elusive in the records. But we figure it's around 1930 or so. And they still used it for training. That part of the gun range over there, Dahlgren used to test his guns there before they were moved down to Dahlgren, and then also farther down into Calvert County, because the folks in Annapolis used to complain that it would shake the windows in the historic houses. He was making way too much noise for people in Annapolis. Okay. So Fort Madison, even though it's not there now, it played an important role up until the period in between World War I and World War II. Nope. Okay, so those of you who are not familiar with Baltimore, the Patapsco River, all kinds of little creeks feeding into it. This is an area that, all those little bodies of water would have had, the traditional, plantation houses from the 17th century, tobacco farms. This part of Maryland actually shifts away from tobacco early in the colonial period and moves to grains, wheat. They're actually growing hemp because one of the things that Baltimore is known for is its shipyards. So they're growing hemp to make rope and things of that nature. But you can see how Fort McHenry is very well placed. Okay? Try to get into Baltimore Harbor, and you literally have to sail, just like I was talking about before with Fort Madison, you have to sail directly at Fort McHenry. And if you ever have a chance to sail, it is a spectacular view going up the Patapsco River and sailing past Fort McHenry. Okay? So Baltimore, this is more of a modern map, where you see it says Fells Point and Federal Hill. Those are the two areas that in the late 18th century and into the 19th century had the most settlement. But Baltimore did not see, again, dramatic settlement until after the 1820s or so. Okay? So this is your Fort McHenry, star-shaped, traditional fort. We have folks from Poland and France that are known for these fort designs. They kind of harken back to, some of them have some medieval ancestry. We have the Fort Washington in that area being influenced by folks like L'Enfant. So we have Fort McHenry. Okay, so this is our traditional star-shaped fort. Fort Madison across the river looked very similar. Wasn't quite as large, but looked very similar. It was a very substantial building. It shows up on charts, navigational charts, and maps because it's aid to navigation. This was literally sitting on one of the bluffs, you know, the bluffs that you have on the Severn River. So we see it on maps for years and years. So Fort McHenry and Fort Madison are contemporaries, except for Fort McHenry was one of those areas where you had the earthenworks, you know, during the American Revolution, and then it was redeveloped later. Okay, and again, it's used during the Civil War. It is a hospital during World War I, and then for training, and then it's, you know, been the home of the Star-Spangled Banner, but now, of course, is owned by the Park Service. Okay. Fort Washington, and I'm sorry, these lights, kind of hard to see, but literally across the river from Mount Vernon, and, you know, far enough south where, you know, you can protect Washington, you can protect Alexandria. From a trade standpoint, again, we talked about why are they protecting these areas? Because trade, Alexandria is far more important. DC is the seat of government and everything. But when it comes to generating those tariffs and the trade, Alexandria is the place where the money is during this period. Okay, so location of Fort Washington. Okay, Fort Washington, again, parts of it were reconstructed. And I'll show you some images from Fort Madison. That lozenge shaped is more of the modern reincarnation. Over time, different things were added. World War I, World War II, and especially a lot of areas for, of gun platforms and stuff for testing. This view down here, you know, it's basically, they are at Mount Vernon. You know, you can see it depending on your line of sight. So this, again, is contemporary to Fort Madison. This is what it looked like between World War I and World War II. Much larger complex. You know, you think of it as your traditional military installation with housing and recreation and everything that you associate. I mean, it doesn't look that different from maps of this area, from around Annapolis. Okay, so you know where I am, right, in this picture. Talked about the YP Basin and the patch of trees directly above it. That was where Fort Madison was located. Okay. Initially, one of the things I do as a geek, history geek, is to do land records research. So I started with the land records because we had charts and maps that showed where the fort was, but we didn't have like a chain of title over time. The federal governments in these early days, you know, had to buy land from private owners to establish these different things. So this was a large parcel of land known as Carr's Prospect. This little creek there is now been filled in by the Navy. It doesn't exist any longer. So I know that's kind of an abstract thing, but that is, I'm going to skip this since we're short for time, but this is talking about the meets and bounds and laying out the property. And this is a much better rendition of that, okay? So Carr's Creek, which is now spelled with a C if you look at it on a map, okay? So if you've been over there, Carr's Creek, and Little Carr's Creek. Little Carr's Creek is now filled in. That's literally the gun range, okay? That entire area has been filled in. In this little rectangle, 4 3/4 acres, 5 acres, depending on who was doing the math, is where Fort Madison was located. Okay. Again, showing all of the land records that luckily were very rich to help determine the location of the fort. So there is Fort Severn, okay, before, you know, a good 40 years before Naval Academy. And this map is a wee bit off, but it again shows you that, you know, when you are trying to get into Annapolis, they're going to protect the harbor. You have two very robust ways to protect the area. So this map, this is one of those history geek moments where you stand in the archive, you jump up and down and clap your hands, and the archivists think you're crazy. But when I found this map, this is dated from 1819, so this is after, of course, the War of 1812, and it's showing the two forts that protect Annapolis. It's showing Fort Madison, and then it's showing the gun battery, which is now under your dorm. Okay. So it wasn't as large and as laid out as Fort McHenry. They have a smaller area to work with, but it has that star-shaped fort. It's got the buildings. Those buildings were brick. Those buildings were to store, you know, the munitions and the gunpowder. And there was a officers' barracks, and then there was an enlisted barracks. Okay. So when it comes to protecting Annapolis, keep in mind that in the 17th and 18th century, it was very important, and that everything had to do with trade. And sea-coast defense was our first defense before we had the Navy. Okay, thank you.